Daniel Mercer had built Fresh Mart from the ground up, transforming it into one of the nation's leading grocery chains. From the gleaming corporate offices on the top floor of his headquarters, everything looked perfect. Sales were high, customer satisfaction surveys painted a glowing image, and investors were happy. But beneath that polished surface, an undercurrent of unease had begun to fester. It started with letters. Not the usual customer complaints about expired produce or slow checkout lines, but anonymous, hand-scrawled notes mailed directly to his office. They spoke of cruelty, neglect, and a manager whose contempt for elderly customers bordered on open hostility. Daniel had dismissed the first few, assuming exaggeration, but as more arrived, each detailing similar grievances, he could no longer ignore them. The board suggested an internal review, a quiet audit that wouldn't ruffle feathers. But Daniel wanted the truth, not a watered-down report. And so, for the first time in years, he stepped away from his title, his tailored suits, and the luxury of detached decision-making. He became Daniel Reeves, a middle-aged man with a patchy employment history, seeking work at one of his own stores. The branch in question was an unremarkable location on the outskirts of town, the kind of place that served retirees and working-class families. It had been running for years, a staple of the community, but according to the letters, something had gone wrong. The moment Daniel stepped through the automatic doors, dressed in scuffed sneakers and a faded sweatshirt, he felt it. The tension wasn't loud. It wasn't the kind of overt hostility one might expect, but it was there, lurking in the stiff posture of the employees and the tired, wary glances exchanged between them. He approached the customer service desk, where a young woman with dark circles under her eyes barely looked up before shoving a clipboard his way. Application. Right here, Daniel said, sliding the forged resume across the counter. She gave it a cursory glance, then jerked her chin toward a door marked Employees Only. Manager's office is in the back. If he likes you, you'll start tomorrow. Daniel muttered a thanks and pushed through the door, his stomach tightening as he prepared for his first meeting with Rick Dawson, the man at the center of every complaint. Rick sat behind a battered desk, thick arms crossed over his broad chest, his shirt slightly too tight around his bulk. He had the look of someone who had once been athletic, but had since let the weight of authority soften him. He glanced up, barely concealing his disinterest. "You're the new guy?" "Daniel Reeves," he said, keeping his voice level. Rick leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. "Ever worked retail?" "Yeah. Few places," Daniel said, keeping his answer short. Rick scanned the resume, smirking slightly. "Says here you were at a mom-and-pop shop for 6 years. Why'd you leave?" "Closed down," Daniel lied smoothly. "Owners retired." Rick made a noise that might have been amusement. "Figures. The little guys can't keep up anymore. All right, here's the deal. We're short-staffed, and I don't have time to hold hands. You're on register duty. Don't chat, don't slow down, and don't let the lines build up. Got it?" Daniel nodded. Rick stood, grabbing a folded uniform shirt from a pile on a metal shelf. "Clock in at 6 sharp. If you're late, don't bother coming in. And one more thing," he added, his smirk flattening into something colder. "We get a lot of old-timers in here. They'll waste your time, ask dumb questions, and hold up the line. Keep it moving. Got it?" The words hit harder than Daniel expected. He forced himself to keep his expression neutral, only nodding in response. Rick seemed satisfied. "Good. See you tomorrow." Daniel left the office with the uniform in hand, his mind already churning. He had expected arrogance, perhaps even indifference. But open disdain? That was something else entirely. The next morning, he arrived before sunrise. The store smelled of freshly mopped floors and cardboard boxes, the usual morning routine of unpacking shipments and setting up displays. Employees moved with tired efficiency, some exchanging quiet greetings, others too weary to bother. At the register next to his, a woman in her 40s with a kind face and a strained smile was setting up her till. She glanced at him and offered a tired but genuine, "First day?" "Yeah, Daniel," he said. "Lisa," she replied. "Don't let Rick get to you. Well, you'll see." A sharp voice cut through their exchange. Less talking, more working. Rick had appeared behind them, arms folded, eyes scanning the floor as if looking for something. Someone to criticize. Lisa lowered her gaze and focused on her register. Daniel felt a slow burn of anger, but said nothing. The morning rush was uneventful, but as the hours passed, Daniel noticed a pattern. Younger customers were greeted with forced enthusiasm, their transactions quick and smooth. But the moment an elderly customer approached, the atmosphere shifted. An older woman with silver hair and a floral cardigan fumbled for her wallet, her hands unsteady. The man behind her sighed loudly, but before Daniel could reassure her, Rick's voice cut through the air. "Need help moving along, ma'am?" The false politeness in his tone was thin, barely concealing his impatience. The woman flinched. "I'm sorry, dear, Just try to be quicker next time," Rick said, already turning away. Daniel clenched his fists beneath the counter. As the day wore on, similar moments played out again and again. An elderly man was brushed off when he asked for assistance finding an item. A frail woman struggling with a heavy basket was ignored. And always Rick was there, watching, ensuring efficiency at the expense of dignity. By the end of his shift, Daniel had seen enough to confirm what the letters had warned of, but he also realized something worse. It wasn't just Rick. It was the atmosphere he had created, a culture of quiet compliance. Employees saw what was happening, but no one spoke out. Whether from fear, exhaustion, or simple self-preservation, they had accepted it as the norm. Daniel clocked out and stepped into the cold evening air, his breath fogging in front of him. His hands tightened into fists as he stared back at the glowing Fresh Mart sign. This wasn't just a bad manager. It was a rot that had settled into the foundation of his company, and he wasn't going to let it stand. The days blurred together in a rhythm of routine and silent observation. Daniel Mercer, still Daniel Reeves to everyone around him, became just another tired face in the checkout line, ringing up groceries, handling impatient customers, and watching. Always watching. Rick Dawson ruled the store with an iron grip, and his disdain for the elderly customers was only a piece of the problem. The deeper Daniel looked, the more cracks he saw. Employees walked on eggshells, their movements stiff, and their conversations hushed whenever Rick was nearby. It wasn't just about efficiency, it was about control. One evening, as Daniel was stacking impulse buy candy bars near the registers, Lisa leaned in and whispered, "They fired Maria today." He glanced at her. "Why?" Lisa's mouth pressed into a tight line. "She spent too long helping Mrs. Connors bag her groceries." Daniel felt a slow coil of anger wrap around his gut. Maria had been an older employee herself, warm and patient with customers, especially those who needed extra time. She had worked here for over a decade. Rick fired her. Lisa nodded, said she was too slow, holding up the line. But we all know what it was really about. Daniel clenched his jaw. It wasn't inefficiency. It was the same reason Rick constantly rolled his eyes at older shoppers, the same reason he pushed employees to rush them along. They weren't the right kind of customer. They slowed down his perfect system. That night, Daniel stayed late, watching as Rick did his final walkthrough. Employees avoided his gaze, quickly finishing their tasks and scurrying out the door before he found a reason to reprimand them. Daniel lingered near the storage area, pretending to straighten a stack of shopping baskets as Rick passed by. "You worked a full shift," Rick said, stopping near the exit. "What are you still doing here?" Daniel forced a casual shrug, getting a feel for the place. Rick studied him for a moment, then chuckled. "You don't seem as useless as some of the others." Daniel's skin crawled, but he kept his expression neutral. Rick leaned against the doorframe. "Let me give you some advice. You want to last here? Don't get attached. The minute you start caring about the wrong people, you're screwed." Daniel met his gaze, holding back the urge to challenge him. "Noted." Rick smirked, slapping the doorframe before heading out into the night. The next morning, Daniel arrived early, slipping into the break room where a handful of employees were quietly sipping burnt coffee. A young man, barely out of high school, sat hunched over his phone. His uniform was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot. "Tyler, you okay?" Lisa asked, her voice laced with concern. The kid exhaled heavily, rubbing his face. "Didn't sleep. My mom," She's been sick, and I had to take care of her last night. Daniel watched as Lisa reached out, giving Tyler's arm a gentle squeeze. You should go home, she said softly. Rest. Tyler let out a bitter laugh. Yeah? And risk getting fired like Maria. The room fell silent. No one had an answer. Daniel's hands curled into fists. This wasn't just about customer treatment anymore. This was about fear. Fear that had woven itself into every corner of this store, making good people believe they had no choice but to endure it. An hour later, as Daniel was scanning items at the register, a familiar voice cut through the hum of the store. I don't have all day, lady. Rick stood at the end of an aisle, arms crossed as he stared down an elderly woman who was struggling to count out exact change. Her hands trembled slightly, her face flushing with embarrassment. Daniel's grip tightened around the barcode scanner. Rick sighed loudly, looking toward the other customers in line. Anyone got $1 to spare so we can move this along? A few people chuckled awkwardly. The woman's hands froze, her knuckles widening. Daniel abandoned his register. He walked over, keeping his tone even. I've got it. He pulled a bill from his pocket and handed it to the woman before she could protest. She looked up at him, eyes wide with gratitude. Rick's expression darkened. Problem, Reeves? Daniel met his gaze, feeling the weight of every employee's eyes on them. No problem, he said evenly. Rick held the stare for a long moment, then forced a laugh. Look at that. Our new guy's a hero. He clapped Daniel on the back hard enough to make a point. Let's not make a habit of it, though. We're not running a charity. Daniel forced himself to nod, but inside, the fire was burning hotter than ever. He was done watching. It was time to act. The store buzzed with the usual midday rush, the beeping of registers blending with the chatter of customers and the distant hum of the refrigeration units. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. Daniel felt it in the way employees glanced at him, the way Lisa seemed more hopeful, the way Tyler managed a small nod of appreciation when he arrived that morning. A silent ripple had started to form, one that Rick hadn't yet noticed. Rick had power, but it thrived on silence. The moment people started questioning him, that power would crack. Daniel didn't have long to wait. An elderly man approached the register, his cane tapping against the tile as he unloaded his basket with slow, deliberate movements. The line behind him grew impatient, but Daniel didn't rush him. You take your time, sir, he said, offering a small smile. The man exhaled in relief, returning the smile with a slight nod. He was counting out his bills when Rick's voice sliced through the air. For God's sake, this again? Daniel turned, his jaw tightening as Rick approached, arms crossed, impatience etched into every line of his face. We've got a store to run, Rick snapped. If you're going to hold up the line, maybe you should shop somewhere else. The elderly man flinched, his face falling. Lisa, standing at the next register, froze mid-scan. Tyler, bagging groceries nearby, looked away, his grip tightening on a carton of eggs. A heavy silence fell over the front end of the store. Daniel set down the cash he had been counting, standing to his full height. That's enough. Rick's eyes snapped to him. What did you just say? You heard me, Daniel said, his voice calm but firm. That's enough. The tension in the air was palpable. Employees had stopped what they were doing. Customers were watching. Rick let out a short laugh. You really think you're going to tell me how to run my store? Daniel didn't move. It's not your store. Rick's smirk faltered. Excuse me. Daniel took a slow step forward. This store exists because of its customers. People like him, he gestured toward the elderly man, who have been shopping here for years, who deserve respect. And you, his voice dropped, ice creeping into his tone, are the only problem here. Rick's face darkened. You're fired. Daniel's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. You can't fire me, Rick. A flicker of confusion passed over Rick's face. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out his real ID, flipping it open for everyone to see. The color drained from Rick's face. My name is Daniel Mercer, he said, his voice carrying through the store. I own Fresh Mart. A stunned silence followed. Lisa's eyes widened. Tyler's mouth fell open. A murmur ran through the employees, a mixture of disbelief and realization. Rick stumbled over his words. This is a joke." "No joke," Daniel said smoothly. "You've been treating customers like an inconvenience, abusing your employees, firing good workers because they don't meet your impossible standards." He let the weight of the words sink in. "That ends today." Rick's bravado wavered, but he forced a sneer. "You don't know how things work here. You sit in an office while we do the real work. You think you can run this place better than me." Daniel didn't hesitate. "I know I can." Rick's face turned a deep shade of red. His grip tightened into fists, but he had lost. The employees knew it. The customers knew it. He wasn't in control anymore. Security arrived minutes later, escorting Rick out as he hurled every excuse and insult he could muster. But no one was listening. As the doors closed behind him, Daniel turned back to his employees. "Things are going to change," he said. "Starting now." Lisa was the first to smile. Tyler exhaled, relief washing over his face. One by one, the employees straightened their shoulders, as if shaking off a weight they had carried for too long. For the first time since stepping into this store, Daniel felt something new in the air. Hope. The silence Rick left in his wake was thick with disbelief. For a long moment, no one spoke. Employees exchanged wide-eyed glances, unsure of what to do, what to say, now that the storm had passed. Customers lingered, watching Daniel as if expecting him to snap his fingers and remake the store on the spot. Daniel took a slow breath. The hardest part was over. Now came the real work. "All right," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We're open for business." The employees hesitated. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, they returned to their stations. Registers beeped, carts rolled, and conversation returned in hushed waves. But beneath it all, something fundamental had shifted. The fear that had wrapped around this store like a vice had cracked. Lisa approached him first. "So what happens now?" Daniel met her gaze. "We rebuild." That afternoon, he called a store-wide meeting. Employees gathered in the break room, some leaning against lockers, others sitting at the long, scuff table. The air was thick with uncertainty, but also something else, hope. Daniel stood at the front, looking at each of them. "I came here expecting problems," he admitted, "and I found them. But I also found good people, people who care about their work, their customers, each other." He let his words settle before continuing. "Rick Dawson no longer represents this store. His way of doing things is done." A murmur of relief spread through the room. "But change doesn't happen overnight," Daniel continued. "And it doesn't happen without effort. We're going to make this a place people want to work. A place customers feel welcome. That starts with all of you." Tyler shifted in his seat. "Does that mean we're getting breaks that don't get cut short?" A chuckle rippled through the employees. Daniel smiled. "Yes, Tyler. It means fair breaks. It means scheduling that actually makes sense. It means treating customers like people, not obstacles. And it means no one gets fired for doing the right thing." Lisa crossed her arms. "What about Maria?" Daniel nodded. "I already called her. She starts back on Monday." That was when the first genuine smile spread through the room. Over the next few weeks, changes took root. Some were small, cleaner break rooms, a suggestion box that wasn't ignored, a simple thank you at the end of a shift. Others were bigger. A new hiring process. Better training. Employees who had once shrunk under Rick's scrutiny now stood taller, spoke up, took pride in their work. And the customers noticed. Mrs. Connors, the elderly woman Rick had humiliated, returned hesitantly at first, her hands trembling slightly as she approached Daniel's register. He greeted her with the same kindness he had before, and this time, no one rushed her. She left with a smile. Word spread. Seniors who had avoided the store began trickling back. A warmth returned to Fresh Mart, something that had been missing for too long. One evening, as Daniel prepared to leave for the night, Lisa approached him near the doors. "You're not just going to disappear on us, are you?" He smiled. "I'll be around. Not as a cashier, but I'll be watching, making sure this place stays what it should be." Lisa studied him for a moment, then nodded, satisfied. As Daniel stepped into the cool evening air, he looked back at the store. The same building, the same fluorescent lights, but now it felt different. This wasn't just about fixing one store. It was about setting a standard, about proving that leadership wasn't about power. It was about responsibility. Rick Dawson had built a kingdom of fear. Daniel Mercer had torn it down. And in its place, he had built something stronger.